been a minute, so let me catch you up, because there's been a lot of stuff happened since I've been on here last, and I have a bunch more stuff coming up. However, we will not be hearing the car run this video. Hopefully I will be getting a full tune drive and startup video ready for you guys for this weekend. But in the meantime, let's get into it. Alright, on to putting pistons on the connecting rods. This really is not a hard process. A lot of people get scared by it because they think, oh man, I've got to heat the end of the connecting rod, and I've got to press this wrist pin through, and if you don't get it right, it's a mess. You got to start over with a new piston. I mean, you're right, but nothing to be scared of, especially if you have the ability to make yourself a quick tool that positively stops the wrist pin, and you'll see why here in a second. And there's plenty of videos on YouTube explaining how to do this, showing how to do this, but I'm going to do another one just in case some of you out there haven't seen them. Maybe this may be a first time for you even doing car stuff, so here we are. Anytime you get an engine you're going to rebuild, it's always a good idea to do the pistons. Even if you somehow manage to get one that the bore stays standard on, it's possible that the pistons don't check out, but the bore does. You may get away with putting a standard piston back in the bore. Anyway, you're going to do it. The right way is to freshen the bore up, put new pistons in that fit the bore. And to do that in a lot of production engines, you have to press the old piston off, which I showed in another video, and then you have to install the new piston, and you can't just press them in. You have to heat them up, and then you have to shove the pin through right there, and you want it to be able to stop, because if you go too far, it'll run out past the edge of the piston and it'll contact the cylinder wall, and that is bad. You don't want any contact between that and the center or the cylinder wall. So you take your distance here and you figure out how much distance you need for it to come out to stop, and then you can set your stop to that. I'll show you what that'll do here. I always set the front of the engine marks, any of the engine marks that say front of engine, which top of the piston, would be this little notch. I set it towards the screw. I line it up with this screw and this screw so it's centered on that pin. And I run this down. It doesn't have to be super tight, just snug enough that you don't pull it up off of there. Now I'm going to fire up the torch here. What I've had chilling in the freezer over here is the wrist pins. I put them in a magnetic tray, and I put them in my garage freezer right there. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to heat this small end of the connecting rod up. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow that hole to grow ever so slightly, thousandths of an inch that will grow. The frozen wrist pins have shrank thousandths of an inch. Well, they're only like 3 thousandths of an inch interference, so you can imagine they just slide together at this point, with that one being cold and this being hot. And you'd be right, which is why you kind of want something to stop so you don't shove it all the way through, because that would be bad. You also don't want to overheat this. I'll shut this off a second because wasting gas. But you also don't want to overheat this. You don't want to turn it red. It'll start to turn a caramelized brown, kind of like down here. But then it'll go to a blue color. And as soon as it gets to that blue color all the way around, and of course you want to like uniformly move it around on the heat and flip it over, get both sides. But once you have that blue color, it's time. It doesn't have to be any hotter than that. You drop it right in here in line, and you slam the pin home, and as soon as the pin goes home, you make sure the connecting rod goes up against this side, so everything is maxed out. And then let it cool. Just let it sit there, it'll cool. The connecting rod will shrink around the pin, and the pin will swell up in the connecting rod. They will lock themselves together. Moving this around, see if I can get this tipped up just a little bit. Okay, see it a little better while I'm doing this. I'm moving this around. I'm not keeping the heat in one spot. I'm just moving it around. And then I'm going to flip it over. Okay, this gets it pretty warm. I don't have to get it super hot right this second. Just need to get it close. I'm not to switch hands and film at the same time. It's going to be a bit of a dance, but you get the idea. It's starting to turn a brownish color. As soon as I start to get that bluish color, that's when I'm ready to ram it home. So I'm going to flip this camera down. I'm going to pull it back here out of the heat a little bit. I'm going to grab a wrist pin out of the freezer here. And then you get to see the magic. One thing you want to make sure you're doing is making sure before you stick this rod back in there that you have it the right direction. Because if you put the rod in backwards, you're screwed. You got to start over. You got to press it back off, which usually means breaking the piston. Definitely means deforming the piston. And that means a new piston. So this is the point where you don't want to screw up. This is why a lot of people get scared of it. Just take it to a machine shop. Well, machine shop do it. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if you decide you want to try and tackle it, it's not that hard to do. Alright, I'm coming up on a bronze color. I'm starting to get a blue. I'm going to get my cold wrist pin ready. Alright, here we go. You hear it sizzling. They're coming to temperature. And what we got here is I'm flat up against the wrist pin stop. I'm all the way into the piston, and I've got the wrist pin all the way over. And again, once that cools, you'll be able to move that, and the wrist pin will move with the rod, and it won't come out too far on either side and give you any contact problems. Let's see if it's cool to get out. Oh yeah, see? We come out just enough. We come out the same amount on both sides. And we have free movement. And that's all there is to it. It really wasn't that bad. Now you too can try this. Now, what I have recommended to people in the past is if you're worried about doing this with your parts that are brand new, let me get you off of here. If you're worried about your parts that are brand new getting screwed up on your first try, find yourself some old connecting rods and some old pistons. There's a few of them that will come off if you press them off carefully. That will give you plenty of practice. Because you can keep heating the connecting rod over and over and over again. As long as you never overheat it, you'll never have a metallurgy problem. You'll never have a metal problem with it being soft. So what happens is, you're getting the practice throwing the wrist pin in the right spot. And you're not screwing up a brand new piston. So, little tip, you can try that. You don't always have access to stuff like that, so if you do, it's nice. If not, you can always just dive right into it. I mean, that's how I did it. First engine I put together, it ran great, and then it didn't. Of course, you know, it blew up. It was a learning curve, but I also wasn't working on a car engine either. We were working on lawnmower engines at the time, so this is something that you can progress into, or this is something you can just dive headlong into. In engines and engines. So practice on a small engine, something that isn't going to be your daily driver. Find an old engine that can be tore apart that you can study, and you can do things like this with. Alright, now I had talked about file fitting the rings, and since I'm going to do a new set right now, I get to show you how taking them out of the box and jamming them in the engine is never going to be a good idea. A couple reasons. This particular ring set already had a couple flaws in the second ring, which would have ended up with too large of a gap to begin with, and we would have had to get a larger set of rings, only because it would have fallen outside of stock ring specs. Now, of course, we go a little bigger here, because when you introduce things like boost or nitrous, or if you want to run the ring just a little looser on a race engine that's NA, you can. You typically go for, like with superchargers, you'll go for 7 here as opposed to 4. Same here, 63 as opposed to 4. And this is times the bore size, so whatever your bore size is. So we're looking for 20 thousandths and 22 thousandths. 20 thousandths for our second ring and 22 thousandths for our top ring. This tends to fall somewhere in the 10 to 16 range for most engines that are stock, and same for here. But again, you want the rings to have a little bit larger gap, because when you add boost, you're adding a lot of heat, and the rings will close up that gap down here. The rings will close that gap up, and then what happens is the gap will be closed, the ring has nowhere to go, and the ring goes up or down and it shatters the ringland, which is part of what happened with this engine. This other engine that we had gotten. So if you look here, I'm going to zoom in, you can see, I don't know if you can tell here, there, you can see that gap, that ring gap is not straight. Okay, it checks out here at the very edge for a stock bore, but we need to go 20 on the second ring. So I've got my 20 thousandths feeler gauge out here, and you can see we're really close. Like the inside edge of this ring right here is 20 thousandths. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this ring out and I'm going to file that, and I'm going to file it straight to get rid of that tapered V that's in that gap. Let's see if we can find a straight one here to compare it to. Aha. Okay. So this one also is right out of the box, not file fit yet. But you see how much straighter that gap is? I'll take my gap gauge here, and look at that. Right out of the box, I have probably a 18 or 19 thousandths gap right out of the box. So that was already too big for stock. It's perfect for what I've got. I just got to clean it up. Okay, I got another V groove ring. Let's see, not quite 20. And then I've got another, I think another nice straight, semi-straight ring, cut ring that needs to open up. That's probably close to stock. So these are right out of the box. They're right out of the box. Oops. Let me zoom out here. Those rings are right out of the box, fresh, brand new rings. And for a stock engine, they were already a bit out of spec, which is no good. You don't want your engine to burn oil or lose compression, so this would be another set of rings for a stocker, but since I'm going to open them up, it's perfect. Now what I've done here is when I check these, I check them pretty much down here in this area of the bore, which is about the distance they're going to sit when they're at top dead center anyway. And what I do to make sure they're straight in the bore is I will take one of these here, and after I've started them in the hole, I use the piston to square them up in the bore, and I use the bottom of the last ringland as my template for how deep I want to go into the bore. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through and I'm going to file these open. I'm going to keep taking them out and carefully filing them and rechecking them until these are at 20 thousandths. And then I'm going to install them on the pistons. And then I have my top rings there that I will repeat the process. Once I've got the top rings done, I can then take everything back out, get this thing flipped over, and start running the pistons with these rings back into their homes and get this engine finished up. So once we get this engine finished up, it gets to go back in the car and I get to finish the car up. We were almost done. I just had a little bit left on the car, but bent crank put us back. So in the meantime, you guys got to see how to file fit these rings. I'm going to file fit a couple of them, and I'm going to do one on camera so you can see how it's done. And we'll go from there. So stay put, and I'll be right back with the ring we're going to file fit together. Alright, I got a couple of them done already. Let's see, as you can see, that's a nice uniform straight line now. And my 20 thousandths, let's see if I can get it to go for the camera, just drags through there. And you want it to just touch enough to drag through the ring. And once you have it gapped for a particular cylinder, it needs to stay in that cylinder. So what I usually do is I'll run through all the second rings, throw them on the pistons where they need to go, and then I'll run through all the top rings and then install them on the pistons as I go, because I already have the pistons and rods ready to go in each home. And then again, I'll go through one of these on camera on how to do it. Less is more. You're going to go little bits at a time, and you're going to feel like, well, I need to take a ton off of that to get that to meet up with this. No you don't. You can simply drag it across the file once and take enough off to change it drastically. So it's all about pressure, patience, and I've had these two rings in and out 4 times and 7 times to get perfect. Okay, now I got my 20 thousandths in here. I've had this ring out 2 or 3 times now. Not quite in there. Like I said before, we're gonna carefully take the ring back up out of here. And there is a dot. I don't know if that comes in focus or not on there. Can you see the little dot in there? Little tiny dot right there on the top of the ring.
Yep.
Okay. Every ring should have some kind of a marker. If not, you have to go by the taper on the very side of the ring. You'll have to trust me, this has a taper a certain direction, and the ring on the top will have a taper the other direction because of the way they go up and down against the wall. the way they seal, the taper has to be a certain direction depending on where it sits. So what I'm going to do now is where you saw the rings had the tapered seat, I carefully butt them together, and you notice I've started to clean up that straight line. It's not an angled line anymore. They meet, they touch, they're parallel. So what I'm going to do now, I don't have a whole lot to take off. I don't have a ring filer. So what I have is a very fine file, and I have it set so the grain will take material off as I go this direction and only this direction, and that's because I don't want burrs pointed towards my cylinder wall. I want the burrs inside so I can clean them up later if I need to. And again, a little goes a long way. I'm going to take this, I'm going to lay it up against flat on my file, I'm going to apply just a little bit of pressure. I'm going to make a couple drags. Usually about 4. Okay, clean it up. Double check that I'm still parallel. And I'm going to stick this back down in the bore. And then this is where I'm going to square up. This is where I'm going to square up that ring using the piston again. And I set it to the exact same height every time. Now when I should get in here, I should have about 20 thousandths. No, see, and I'm still not quite there. Okay, so I'm gonna have to pull it out and file it again. But this is what I have to do for all the rings. You should always check your ring packs. Anytime you get a new ring pack, you want to make sure that you take them out and fit them to the bore if you can. Otherwise, you'll end up with leaks. You'll end up with oil control problems. You'll end up with lost compression, and an engine that has a fresh bore and brand new pistons, there should be no reason for that. Even in an older engine, if you're reusing old pistons on a wore-out bore, this can still benefit you if you want to take the time to check your ring gaps. Your book will have specifications for stock engine builds. Again, the ring gap stuff I had over here on my refrigerator, this is math I did for a boosted application. This is a supercharged application. These gaps are a lot bigger than what you would normally use in a stock engine. So refer to the book for the actual stock specs. But that's it. I'm going to move on to doing all the top rings, and I will see you here again in just a little bit when I go to slam these pistons back in this engine. Alright, so we have another step in the Chevette engine that is kind of Chevette specific, but also can be other engine specific depending on the application. Very rarely do I ever come across engines that need an anaerobic sealant in place of a gasket or a RTB silicone sealant, but this is a very important one. On this engine, the head bolts go through the cam carrier and then go down through the cylinder head here. And this area that seals between the top of the cylinder head and this right here have to be perfect, and they have to have no thickness change. And what that means is if I torque the head gasket down and there's a paper gasket between here, that paper gasket is going to change my torque sequence, or not my torque sequence, but my torque spec. My overall torque spec will change across all the bolts, and it will cause this thing to look like a piece of bacon, because it'll only tighten down here, and it'll want to kind of push off in the middle where there's no torque. So what they recommend is an anaerobic sealant. And what an anaerobic sealant is a compound similar to Loctite, and this does not cure until there is torque put on it. So until I put it on here and I put pressure on it, it stays tacky. That's why they call it a set and seal. Now what you do here is you lay it on very thin, because again, these two pieces need to be married. If you don't do this right, there's a couple reasons why you want to do this right. One, your oil leaks. You don't want oil leaks between the case and the cam carrier, because or the head and the cam carrier, because you'll end up having to take the head bolts loose again to fix this problem. Which usually means head gasket, because as soon as you release the pressure on it, you almost always hear the head gasket click, and once it clicks, retorquing it's probably not good. It's already shifted on its surface. So what you want to do here is, again, you want to go as thin as possible. And I've laid a couple beads here to show what is acceptable and what is not. That is too much. This right through here would be too much. This stuff up here, this is assembly lube, so do not confuse the two. They're the same color, but this is lubricant, this is sealant. But this bead right here is too much. It'll squish out and it'll squish down in and out both sides. Right through here, honestly, is an acceptable level, and right through here is probably too much. So it's a fine line of very thin pressure, or very, very light pressure, and a very thin line. And you just draw a line through the center as much as you possibly can. And again, you want to lay down really about like that all the way across. I'm going to wipe this all off and redo it. But you don't want it to squish out. Here's another reason why you don't want it to squish out. This right here is the main oil port in the top of the cylinder head. Okay, you'll get it. A lot of people will use like RTV, or too much of this particular deal will get down in here. And then that pressurized oil port feeds directly into the cam carrier. And if you see, these camshafts are full pressure oiling. So there's no lack of oil up here. This is fully pressurized. The entire cam carrier is fully pressurized. There's oil gallery all the way through this, and the cam itself carries a metered pressurized oil that leaks out over top of the followers here. And so you do not want anything to get in there. And a lot of what you'll see as far as cam lobe failure on a Chevette engine specifically is usually due to contaminants either in one of these oil galleries here in the top of the cylinder head or the cam carrier, or foreign material such as this or RTV. Another thing that people do mistakenly is when you do the valve covers on these, the RTV squishes out inside this cam carrier, and little bits and pieces will break off and end up getting inside this cam. They'll travel all through the engine. This engine is very robust. It will eat RTV until it gets up here. Once it's in the valve train, you will lose your camshaft, guaranteed. Usually it'll also wipe out the lifters, because it'll plug up the ports inside the lifters. Right beside each lifter is a little hole, a little bleed hole. You'll end up with coked up oil in there, or RTV bits in there, and that will kill your camshaft. So a lot of care is taken in this process before the head bolts go down, so you don't end up having to repeat it, and you don't waste a head gasket. One other thing I wanted to cover while we were here, I think that's probably it. Oh, and before this goes down, you want these surfaces very clean. That was what I wanted to that's what I wanted to cover. Okay, one other thing to note about these surfaces before this stuff goes down. Both surfaces have to be either cleaned with brake parts cleaner or an alcohol pad of some sort. This has to be completely contaminant free before this will work properly. So make sure that you've cleaned the surfaces before this goes down. Now I'm going to go ahead and clean this up. I'm going to redo the bead, and then I'm going to go ahead and lock that down. Before I lock this down, I'm going to have a shot of what that bead should look like going around. And there you go. Now we're going to go through an entire engine rebuild series for the Chevette engine specifically, and I'll go into more detail on a lot of the specifics here, but I like to cover some of this as I go because some of this is real teachable right then and there. So here we are. This is your line you want to follow for the most part. You don't have to go to the inside of the bolt holes. There's really no reason. And as you can see, it's not very thick. Again, it has to smash out to nothing. So there is plenty there. There's actually probably more than enough. I've got both surfaces good and clean now, and I'm getting ready to slam this home. All of my bolt threads and bolt hole threads are clean, and I just oil the threads and the washer part of the bolt head with a little bit of motor oil. 530 is usually fine, and run them down, torque them down in sequence, 35, 55, 75 foot-pounds. The 3 times kind of sneaks up on it. With the Felpro head gasket, you already don't have to retorque it, so that just helps. It also helps with the bolts, since you're reusing bolts, old bolts. Inspect all your bolts as well, but it's a little easier on them to sneak up on the torque than it is just go all at once. That generally ends up with broken fasteners and crying, so don't do that. I'm going to finish putting this engine together so I can get it back in the car. Best part of being able to work at home, getting to hang out with the family. You know that was supposed to burn itself out. It's full of cardboard, please. So, a couple modifications I've done here. One, I can now get a stock timing cover back on this. But because of my belt arrangement, the timing cover had to be trimmed in a few unique places. They usually have a lip that stands up off of here, right here, about yay far, probably about a 1/4 inch or so. I had to trim off to clear the belt because it now occupies that space. And I've had to make a couple trims here and there, but for the most part, not only does this fit like stock, it also clears the tensioner for the other belt. And what else is I going to point out here? Oh yes, the timing tab also normally sticks out another 1/4 of an inch because there's no belt over here. So what I did here, I cut it off where I marked where it was supposed to go, trimmed it back. I don't know if it's going to focus in here or not. Maybe not. But I trimmed it back and then spot welded it back to the tab, and it's now out of the way of the belts, and I still have good timing marks to go by. So there's a little bit more of what I've got going on with this. Here's another cool trick I almost forgot. Most Chevettes are only going to have the center hole, as they're designed to sit on 2 dowel pins on the crank gear in there. What I have found is on the crank pulleys that have the 3 grooves for alternator water pump, air conditioning, and power steering, have a hole in the center the same diameter as the giant washer. as opposed to being a really large hole. Let's see if I have one over here to compare it to. Matter of fact, I know I do somewhere. Huh. Well, let's see. Well, at any rate, I must have put it away already. Oh, here it is. Okay. So, you see how big that hole is compared to that hole. Okay. Now you can see why they had to use these two dowel pin holes to locate this to the crank gear, and I'll show you in a second what that's about and what this is, so you can retain your timing marks, because your timing mark's on your crank pulley. So if this pulley slips on those pins, which they do, especially if they've been installed incorrectly and somebody's just jammed it on another direction, it pushes the pins back, which is what happened to this one at one point, which prompted this fix and worked out for also driving a supercharger really well. Because this one had sheared the pins because somebody had put it on wrong on a previous engine, I had to come up with a fix. And my fix was to take the 3-bolt holes on the late model harmonic balancer, well, what would be the harmonic balancer, the crank pulley, for the timing belt. The late models are threaded, so you can use a puller because they're one piece as opposed to the early ones that were 2-piece. So I took advantage of this and I drilled this washer to match that pattern. And then, as you can see, this particular pulley has the smaller hole. It's also really thick right here at the base, which helps. It's no longer relying on the pins. As you can see, the pin is smashed clear into the gear, and this one's rounded off. So that was my fix, but it also worked out because it bolts this solidly to the crank. And then it worked out because it bolts it so solidly to the crank, I can put a lot of force on this without worrying about it shearing the bolt off in the center, which they usually do when you put a lot of force on them. And so I have come up with a cheap and efficient way to make a blower bolt, or a blower pulley, really. And then this is just, I think, M8 hardware. So whatever the thread pitch is for the valve cover bolts, it's the same for that. So remember that if you need a puller, the valve cover bolts are the same thread as this. You can take one of those valve cover bolts with you and match it up if you don't remember what your thread pitch is, but it will be metric for sure. So yeah, that's my fix. Not a bad deal. If I needed to go any further than this, I would probably cut another keyway. If it comes to this thing starting to shear keyways, that'll be the next step. Will be to put another keyway in it. But in the meantime, I think this is plenty. It's not like I'm driving a huge supercharger. That thing's tiny. We're just driving it hard. So anyway, back to assembling the engine. Alright, well, as you can see, it's in. And I've got the inlet side done. What I'm figuring out now is the downpipe, the charge pipe, needs to be cut off right about where that paint mark's at. Maybe a little further forward, but definitely closer to that paint mark. And what that is that's probably the very probably the very maximum part of the bend. Like if you're going to come down to the bottom of the radius where it goes to start getting straight, that's probably the furthest you can go back before it starts to curve. I got to cut that off straight, and then I've got to get probably I'm thinking right about where that line's at. I think dead center will put me just past the radiator here, which will also give us room for future radiator improvement, because it'll come over here to clear, and then of course it's going to come up, so it'll come up right in through here. It's going to 90 this way, and then 90 this way through the intercooler, over, and then up through the top of the carburetor. So I'm going to get these things cut, get a couple things test fitted here, and I'll be right back. Alright, well, charge pipe is now done. Paint's drying. I rushed it a little bit, so that's not grease, that's paint. So there's personalization. Yeah, that's it. I personalized the pipe. But I got good clearance on the radiator. Even if it had an automatic, it would clear the cooler lines. It clears the radiator hose by a whole bunch down there. I don't know if I can get this down there to see that. Got a mile of room around everything. So I think this is going to work out pretty good. Nearing the completion stages, and I have a few things I have to change in the back, but as of right now, I have the old 5/16 line is now returned. Ran a new 3/8 line from the tank all the way up to the rising rate fuel pressure regulator. I got a T in. I'll take it loose here and T into my fuel pressure regulator to set fuel, or my fuel pressure tester to set fuel pressure. Right here. Once I've got the pump primed, it goes and it follows the old fuel line all the way down the car, except for back here, instead of going across, it comes up into the wheel well. And because the fuel pump really does not have any other place to go, I gotta sneak it in here. So the line ran through there. I'm just going to make a small plate to screw in here, to screw that to. The fuel filter will sit up there behind it. And then I got to modify here and here, because this is a 3/8 feed that drops down to 5/16 right here. This is a 5/16 feed that drops down a 1/4 inch right here. This 1/4 inch is going to get cut off here, so it's 5/16. This is the return. Now I'm going to take this out and drill the vent open, because we're going to vent up here. And then later I have some modifications to do when the quarter panels get done, and we'll be adding a vent to the sending unit. Right now I just don't have time, and they don't have one in stock, so I gotta order it. I don't have time. But this is just a generic fuel filter. Goes in line right before the fuel pump. So we're almost done. I'm gonna go throw the brakes on it. I do have one problem I ran into. The torque tube, I don't know if we can see it. Yeah, probably can't see it because it's kind of dark at the moment, but there's a spot right here-ish. It runs into the sway bar. So I gotta notch the torque arm. But I got a fix for that. I'm gonna put a plate under where I got a notch and tie the two bars together. It'll be stronger anyway. So that was one of the little things I ran into back here that as far as my new engineering goes, that was the only thing. Now I just got to finish it up. So I wanted to hear it run tonight. Definitely not going to hear it run tonight. I'm going to finish putting the column together so I can throw it in here tonight. I got to fix the floor and put the carpet back in it. And this thing is done here, other than putting the dash back together once I feed the wires through. So we're close. I can almost twist the key on this thing and hear it. I got a few more modifications on the carburetor done, and I have a couple more to do yet. As you can see, the choke's been removed, but I have to plug that hole, because that is an open vacuum port right at the moment. And then I get the heater box back in here, and I have to plumb the breather tube over into the inlet side. So when crankcase pressure builds up when it's hard on the throttle, it can recirculate. If it's real heavy, depending on how much boost we're cramming in this thing, if it's real heavy, we'll end up putting a catch can in there. But as of right now, that's how that's going to work. So I'm going to get back on this so I can get it finished up. Alright, just doing some last minute preliminary checks. Got to do some alignment, got to do some alignment on these fenders. I got to do some stretching in here, but I've got some fuel system stuff to take care of first. And a set of hood pins to put on it, because this hood's not very savable underneath. We're going to try and do something with it before next year, but likely it's going to be a pin down on the hinges. It'll be okay, but as far as up here, it'll be pinned down. Tank's out. I'm getting ready to pull that sending unit. I gotta clean this garage up just a little bit. That way I can finish the column and finish this. So, lots coming. As I said, but I have project mess to clean up at the moment before I can go any further. So I'm going to do that, and then again we're going to be visiting the startup next video. All right, well, for right now, that's going to be it. I figured I'd shoot a little bit of this to kind of catch you guys up on what I've got going on here and how close I am to getting it done. I'm going to go, I'll probably shoot a little bit more video about the steering, excuse me, I'm tired, the steering setup that's changed, and the fuel system that's going in it. But aside from that, you guys hopefully will be seeing a finished project very soon. So keep the shiny side up.